about ES7.
Hello everyone. My name is Michał Strunek, and I am a student at Politechnika Poznańska. And I am mostly an amateur programmer. Actually, I haven't done anything professionally, so I'm unemployed but open to proposals. Okay, so I wanted to talk about what new features are we going to have in the upcoming ES7 standard, and how they relate to React, how we can use them in our favorite framework. Okay, so the institution that actually is tasked with developing the JavaScript, or more specifically the ECMAScript language, is the ECMA International, and the group which standardizes the JavaScript is specifically called TC39. And as some of you might know, the last specification of JavaScript is the ES6, or called otherwise the ES 2015. And it is ready. It has been approved on June the 17th of this year. It is also called, the official name is actually right now ES 2015, and the new standard will be called ES 2016. The reason for that is because they plan to release a new standard every year. And actually the upcoming standard has been developed at the same time as the previous one. So they could plan ahead and introduce features in ES 2015, which they will be able to build on in the following standard. So right now it is still pretty early in development. There are only specific proposals of features, and to be implemented, every proposal has to go through 5 stages. The first is stage 0, the initial proposal, and then up to stage 4, which is the finished stage, the last stage. And so far only one proposal as of this moment is in the last stage. Only one is decided to be shipping, and I'll tell you later which one it is. So some of you might be wondering, how do we actually use ES7? If we want to use ES6, it is actually all of the modern browsers support it, but if for the reasons of backward compatibility, we should actually transpile it to ES5 if we want to use it. And we have to use Babel for that. And in case you don't know, actually the last version of the Babel 6, which has released very recently, and it has had a lot of changes. And one of the changes is that there is no Babel package in NPM anymore. You have to install Babel core and Babel loader, for example, if you want to use it in Webpack. And also the change is that the Babel by itself doesn't do anything right now. And so if you want to use a specific feature like ES 2015 arrow functions, you have to install a Babel plugin first and then configure Babel to use it. So, but of course, installing a plugin for every feature would be pretty daunting. So you can just install presets, which is a set of plugin, and ES 2015 preset includes all of the plugins which have the features from the last standard. And similarly, stage 0 preset includes all the experimental features from ES7, not released yet. And stage 0 includes all of the features which are now from stage 0 and higher stages, like 1, 2, 3. And now that we install it, we have to configure Babel to use it. So in this case, we can, for example, insert it in our Babel RC file, so that it uses the specific presets. Or if we want to include only specific plugins, we can do that too. Or alternatively, if we use Webpack, we can configure the Babel loader. We have to set the query properly in our configuration. Okay, so now that I've shown you how to use it, I can talk about the specific features. So the first one I want to talk about is decorators. And what is a decorator? It is basically a function that modifies another function or an object or class, or decorate it, in other words. It's actually a feature that's taken straight from Python. And for example, what if we wanted to create a function that can quickly modify any class, any function on a given class to be read-only, so that it's not writable and we cannot modify it. So here I created a read-only decorator, and what it does is, first it takes a target, which in this case will be actually the function object that we are modifying. Second parameter is the key, which is the function name, and the third is the descriptor. And if some of you use the object defining property, a way of defining properties on objects, and as we specify if we want the property to be writable, enumerable. Some of you might have some contact with it, so this is exactly what the descriptor is. And these are the properties that the descriptor has, and we assign the writable parameter on the descriptor to be false, and then we return it, so that every time we use the decorator on a function, the function will be read-only. We will not be able to assign it to something different. So in this case, we use the read-only with the add read-only syntax. This is the new syntax for decorators. So in this case, when we create a new Garfield object, new cat object, when we want to assign a new value to the meow property, it will throw an error because it's not writable. And similarly, we can also use decorators on classes. So in this case, I have a superhero decorator, and it takes a target, which is the class, and we can modify the target in this case. So the function, the purpose of the decorators is, for example, if we have classes which are not related to each other and do not inherit, but we want to have some shared properties, we can use decorators for them. In this case, I assign the superhero property to the target and the power property, so that I use the decorator on the class, and then will have the class will have this property.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it makes sense, but in this case of class, is it possible to decorate
Instance?
exactly the instance?
Actually, yes, and I will show. It's kind of convoluted, but I think I'll be able to show
Because
you.
target in this case is class.
The class. Yes, but you know what you could do? You could because it's the class, but you can also take the prototype of the class.
Mm-hmm.
And if you modify the prototype, you will actually modify every instance in that case. Okay, and how does that relate to React? And some of you who maybe used React in ancient times when we still didn't have the ES6 classes support, which was like a year ago, you might remember that there was such a thing as mixins. And in this case, I have a mixin which gives a default name property to every object, to every component. So the get default props returns an object with the name Skippy, and I mix it into the component one variable object. So then when I render it, the name will be Skippy. But now that the ES6 classes came, it does not actually have support for mixins because it's better. So we have to deal with it in some other way. So one way to deal with it is with the so-called higher order components. So in this case, I created a component 1. And if I want to implement similar functionality with the default name props, I can, for example, create a function which takes a component and returns another component, which will render that one and give it, if we pass the name property to that component, that will be the name. But if we don't, then the default name is Skippy here in that case. And that's how we basically modify the component one, or we can modify any different components to give it a default property of Skippy. And that's called the higher order component pattern. And with decorators, we can do actually very similarly, but we can implement mixins with the ES7 decorators with the add default name syntax. Okay, another feature I want to talk about is yes.
They use multiple decorators for the same.
Yes. And also another thing I haven't mentioned is that the default name here is actually an expression. So, for example, I can the default name could be a function that would actually return a decorator. So I could pass some parameter to the default name, and then the decorator that would be returned would be based on that parameter. Because it's an expression and it can evaluate to anything that would turn out to be a function. Okay, another feature is some nice syntactic sugar. It's rest or spread properties for objects. And you might remember from ES6 how we can destructure or spread arrays in a similar way. Actually, if I substituted the curly braces here for square brackets, I would have array destructuring where the first element of the array would be x, the second would be y, and the rest of the parameters, the rest of the elements would be in array z. In that case, it's very similar, but it's an object destructuring where the x variable will have the x property, y variable the y property, and 2 in this case, and the z will have the rest of the properties on the object A and B in this case. And similarly, we can instead of destructuring, I can also construct objects that way, so that the to the n object, the x property will be the value of the x variable, y will be y variable, and the z object will be spread into the rest of the properties in that object. And in React, actually, it has some use, since this is the official example from the React tutorial. Here I transfer properties from, I consume and transfer properties down to some other HTML tag. It's an input component in this case. I deconstruct the object, this props, and take the checked prop, the title prop, and I get assign rest of the properties to the other object. And I consume, I actually check the check property and the title property and assign values based on those. And I pass all of the other properties to the input component. So that's transferring properties in React. Okay, another pretty nice feature is okay. So as you know, one of the new versions of React is support for the ES6 classes, but there's actually gives us some problems, issues, because, for example, if we want to assign a state, assign some initial value to the state of the component, then I have to do it in the constructor, assign the state value to the constructor, because the only thing we can actually declare in the class is functions. We cannot declare the state property on the class. We have to do it inside the constructor, and we have to remember that we have to get props from the constructor and pass the props to the super, to the class we inherit from. And also, there's no way to declare, because prop types is not an instance property, it's a class property, since every instance of the class has the same prop types and the same default props. So we have to declare them on the class outside of the actual class path declaration, which I think is pretty confusing. It's like a static property in other languages, so we wish we would have that in the ES6 classes. And that's why ES7 actually has a more convenient way of declaring those properties. We can simply declare a state property inside the class, and that will initialize the state to a certain count. And inside this counter component, because it's a component which, as you see, on every click on the div element inside it, fires the tick function, which it increments the counter, and it displays the current state of the count. So with the property initializer, we can pretty easily declare the initial state to be the given prop. And also, we can, since prop types and default props are class properties, we can declare them as static. And that is, I think, pretty convenient and makes declaring component more easy and more intuitive. And this also makes another thing easier. But before I explain it, I have to. It actually uses arrow functions, and in case anybody of you doesn't know what it is, it's basically an easier way of declaring functions. Here I have a array which I want to map a certain function that returns the length of a string, and so that the A2 array will contain the length of each string inside the A array. And with the arrow function, it's actually made it much easier, because on the left side of the arrow I have the list of the parameters, and on the right I have the expression that I want the function to evaluate to. So that, as you see, it reduces a lot of the boilerplate, makes it much more concise. But it's not only syntactic sugar, actually, it changes the functionality, because it has something called the lexical this. Since, for example, in here I pass a callback called grow up to the set interval, because here I have a person constructor. I want the age of the object created by the constructor to be defaulted to 0, and then every second the set interval will increase the age by 1. But if I just set this age, increment this age, it would not do that, because this age inside the growth function would be actually the global object by default. So if I want the object to be available inside the callback, I have to enclose it. I have to assign it to the self variable inside the function, and only then the grow-up function will have the variable. It will be available inside the function. However, it works differently with arrow functions, since this inside the arrow function is this of where the function is actually declared. So in this case, this will be in the person constructor, it will be the newly created object. So when I use this inside the arrow function, it will actually see the object being created. So when I increment it, it will increment the age of the person. And that makes creating a React object easier, because as you saw here, when we use classes, and I pass the tick function to the onClick on the div, I have to bind, because since I used this set state inside the tick, it has to know what this is. It has to know that the current object, current component is this object, the state of which we increment. So we have to bind it, because otherwise you would not know what this is. So we have to call this.tick bind this. If you use the classes, you probably use this syntax, and it's pretty. I think it's pretty confusing, and it's a necessary boilerplate. And another way of this is binding the tick property in the constructor, so that every time we pass the tick, it's already bound. However, with arrow functions, since the this inside them is automatically bound to the to where it is created, it will be automatically bound to the given this component. So that yes,
Yeah, but this exists in ES6, right?
yes. I just okay, but the thing about it is that with ES7 we can declare arrow functions as property on the object.
But in ES6, if you go to the previous example
Yes.
that you showed,
Yeah, this is ES6.
no, not this one. This with the class. Yeah,
Class.
this one. You could just pass, and instead of this tick being this, you could just pass the anonymous function with the which will
arrow function.
which would arrow function exactly.
Which would then fire this dot tick, right?
Yes, exactly. Which will bind properly this. So
Yeah.
what's the like advantage of ES7 in this case?
Well, the advantage is that it's just simple, because we, instead of creating a function that we pass to onClick, we simply initialize the tick property on the class as an arrow function, as you see here. And then we can simply pass the tick without any arrow functions or bindings. Okay, so, and this is actually the ES7 feature which has been approved. This is stage 4 feature, and probably all of us could use the index of. Every time we have to check if something is inside the array, we have to check if the index of is 0 or bigger, or if it's -1. And it's pretty confusing. I think it's every scripting language actually should have something that checks if an object is in an array, and that array includes. I think it's pretty nice and convenient sugar. And yes, the last one and probably the most important feature I want to talk about is the async functions. And first, I want to talk about how we would make blocking AJAX calls. So in this case, I get the story JSON file with AJAX. I assign it to the story object, and then when I get it, I take the first chapter URL of the first chapter, and then fetch it from the server. And then I add HTML to the website that I got from it. And I also have arrow handling inside in case something goes wrong. And whatever happens, I also want to disappear the spinner on the page, so that we know that we don't wait anymore. But the problem, of course, with this code is that it's blocking, which means that while the AJAX call is being processed, since JavaScript code is being processed all the time, we would not be able to do anything. We would not be able to call any callbacks, modify content of the page in any way, because only actually one JavaScript function, one JavaScript call can be executed once. So while this was executed, we would not be able to do anything else, and that's problematic. And that's why we also always make asynchronous calls, which means that only once the call is made, a callback is called and it's executed. And in the meantime, we can do anything. And traditionally, this problem has been solved with callbacks, and this is one way. We tell it to get JSON from the story JSON file, and we give it a function, and we say, okay, once it executes, fire this function and give it error or give it the story. And the problem with it is that first of all, it quickly leads to a so-called pyramid of doom or callback hell, where we place a callback inside a callback, because we say that, okay, once we get the story, we have to get the chapter, and once we get the chapter, we have to add it to a page. This is pretty confusing, pretty complicated, and we have to handle errors ourselves. There's no try catch, which usually error handling was done for us by JavaScript. Now we have to do it by ourselves, and we have to twice actually disappear the spinner twice. We have to add the error text twice. And it's pretty confusing and much more complicated than a simple sequential blocking code. So the problem is that the asynchronous, which is one of the most important features actually in JavaScript, one of the most important things we do, is much more complicated than the blocking code, which is very just inconvenient. So that's why in ES6 improved that by giving us promises. And promise is an object that works according to specification, where the get.json would, in this case, return a promise, and we could call then on the promise, so that once, which means that once the promise resolves, once the call gets finished, and we get the JSON data from the server, we give the data to that function, which takes a story and actually gets the first chapter from the story with get.json, and get.json returns another promise. And the best features of promises is that we can chain them. We don't have to call callback inside a callback, but when the function returns a promise, it means that once that next promise gets resolved, the next functions that we chain gets called, and that function adds HTML to the page. Now, also there's an easier way of handling errors. In this case, we simply call catch on the promise, and the error gets passed down through the then calls until it sees a catch call. So if any error happens, we simply add text to the page, and then after all the errors get handled or the HTML gets added, we disappear the spinner in case whatever actually happens. Okay, but it's still, as you see, it's still pretty. I think it's much more confusing and less clear than the simple blocking code. And that's why ES7 introduces something called async functions. And the way we do this is we declare a function with the async keyword. In this case, I declare a function called story. And then I say await get.json story JSON. And when get.json returns a promise, and what await does is that it says, okay, when I have the promise, when that promise gets resolved, when the correct value gets received from the story call, we pass it down to the variable. And in case something goes wrong, in case there's an error from the promise, I pass it to the catch block. I throw an error. So when we declare a function as async and we fetch something with the await keyword, what it does is that it blocks, it actually stops doing anything until the promise gets resolved. And it's asynchronous so that in the meantime we can't do anything. And so the story gets assigned to the result of the JSON call, and then we fetch the first chapter, and again it stops until actually the chapter gets returned. And what I think is pretty amazing about those async functions is that the code is pretty much the same as the blocking code. It's just as intuitive. As you see, I assign the result to the story variable is then assigned it to the first chapter, except it uses the await keyword, which means it's asynchronous. And then again, the load story function returns another promise since it's asynchronous, so which means that I can also await it inside another function I want to execute.
So, just to recap, when you do await,
Yes.
you stop the execution at this point, but the browser isn't stopped.
No, it isn't.
As
It is asynchronous.
But at the same time, you must modify this JSON to yield to create a proper.
It automatically works on promises. So if getJSON returns a promise, it's with the await keyword, it waits until that promise gets resolved. Okay, so that would be all that I wanted to present to you. If you want to see more of the ES7 features, you can go to the GitHub page of the TC39 group. And also you can go to the plugins page on the Babel website to see which of the features are implemented as plugins. That would be it for me. If you have any questions. No?
Actually, I have one question. Actually, the example with fat arrows, which you contacted to this one. What do you mean by using the anonymous function passing to a component in the?
This is a question for me.
Yeah, actually, yes.
Yeah.
You propose that.
Yeah, in this example here. So basically, if you replace this code here,
Yeah.
with just arrow function, like empty parameters arrow function, this fig, it will work because it will bind properly.
And if I have an argument that are
you can pass them as well.
okay, so I can.
So it's just like longer.
Okay.
If I understood correctly,
So,
anyhow.
Actually, we are using fat arrow that is executing this dot tick inside this body. Right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So
And I think it's worth to mention that in React, in vanilla React, in ES5, when you do this create class,
Yes, you don't
it's
have
already
to bind.
bind for you magically.
yeah.
It's just like magic, so we should be aware of that.
But actually the new fad in the React community is using, I think, those class syntax, so that's why I explained those to you. Okay, that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.